people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the mother relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. This upcoming Friday, unbeaten up-and-comer Christina Cruz will be taking on Amy Salinas.
Broadcast to you by way of Fight TV, FITE TV.
From the Kissimmee Civic Center, war is coming. Christina Cruz will attempt to advance to a professional record of 4-0. She's 3-0 now.
Opposite the ring, Amy Salinas, who sports a professional record of 4 wins, 2 losses, no draws, and no recorded knockouts. Noticeable discrepancy in the fighters' ages.
Christina Cruz, a very vibrant 40 years old to Amy Salinas, who's 18 years younger, a very spry 22. Christina Cruz, the amateur standout turned professional.
Came up in the same amateur class as Michaela Maya, Virginia Fuchs, Clarissa Shields, Marlena Esparza, Tiara Brown, Raquel Miller, Franchon Cruz.
She was in good company in the amateurs. She wants to make a splash in the pros, campaigning in the women's flyweight division. Flyweight, that's where Marlena Esparza reigns as a unified champion.
We'll talk a little bit more about the world title picture later.
She'll be opposite the ring Amy Salinas this upcoming weekend, who dropped a decision to India Smith and unbeaten Jasmine Artiga.
Having fought those kinds of fighters in under 10 fights, it's safe to say that Amy Salinas, she has been matched tough.
She will be sharing the ring with Christina Cruz this weekend. I am going with Christina to win a points decision. Christina on points seems the logical choice. Her amateur pedigree, it shines through in her boxing. She's only got 3 professional fights, but she's already fought on a DAZN show, a Top Rank show,
and Triller.
I've seen Christina in action. She's good. Christina, the network and promotional free agent, she's not with any major promotional outfit, not right now. That could be due to her age in tandem with other outlying factors. Unfortunately, Christina, capable and well-schooled boxer that she might be, her being 40 years old might make promoters hesitant to bring her on board when they can sign younger fighters that have more time to work and more time to develop, whereas Christina...
American promoters, I should say, because Matchroom just signed Nina Hughes, newly crowned WBA champion Nina Hughes, and she's in the same age bracket as Christina.
The effort to grow the sport of women's boxing in the European boxing scene as opposed to the one in the United States, it's not equal across the board. The effort is not the same. In the UK, you've got major platforms like Sky Sports that host an entire stable of female fighters. And DAZN, obviously, but here in America...
PBC ain't got no female fighters.
Top Rank only has two female fighters under contract, Kayla Mayer and Sneecy Estrada.
Golden Boy Promotions, they have 3 or 4. They have unified champion Marlena Esparza. They have Arely Musinho. They have Annabelle Ortiz and Yo Costavalle.
But as stated, the effort is not the same. The effort in the American boxing scene is not akin to what you see in the European one. Wasserman, they've got a couple of girls. Sky Sports and Boxer, Matchroom and DAZN.
They all have more robust stables of Valkyries, robust stables of female fighters that they are developing, more so than what you see over there at Top Rank, PBC, and in this case, Golden Boy Promotions. And that might explain why a fighter as well schooled as a Christina Cruz isn't with a major promotional outfit.
That'd do it in tandem with her age, that in spite of her being a capable fighter, very skilled, very well schooled, she's 40 years old, and that in and of itself might make a major promoter hesitant to bring her on board.
Now, I myself don't think that Christina's too old to make a splash in the sport, and I myself don't think that Christina's too old to win a world title. I actually think she can win a world title, though we have to address certain realities.
When you see a fighter as well schooled as Christina Cruz hasn't been picked up by a major promotional outfit here in the US of A, there has to be a reason, and if I had to guess, that would be the why. that would be the reason.
It's managed by Peter Kahn, a veteran of the sport whose career spans approximately 25 years or so as a manager, advisor.
And he is keeping her busy. He is getting her fights.
It's good that she's getting out there so early in the year because that leaves the rest of it open for other opportunities, other potential matchups, and other potential fights.
It isn't easy, but they're grafting. It isn't easy, but nothing worth having is. I like Christina Cruz to win on points this weekend. I like Christina Cruz to advance to a professional record of 4-0.
I think she can manage that.
Given Christina Cruz's physical dimensions and her base style, the tidiness of her work, the cleanliness of her boxing,
I think she can win on points.
climb up those ranks, continue to climb up those ranks, and see if she can't get in position to challenge for an alphabet title at this weight, the women's flyweight division.
It's where Marlon Esparza is both WBA and WBC champion.
Arely Musinho, she's got the IBF, and Argentina's Gabriela Alanis, she's got the WBO.
Christina hits the ground running this year, plays her cards right, and keeps busy. She might be able to get one of them in the ring.
In men's lightweight news, boxing insider Rick Glacier, via his inside sources, says the Tank Davis versus Hector Garcia pay-per-view number with all platforms in did just 61,000 buys, which is much less than I had thought it would do. Tank is a great ticket seller, but he's not selling pay-per-view, as it's illegally being streamed. Pirating is really killing the boxing pay-per-view model.
Piracy definitely has its role to play. The piracy issue is a much bigger issue now than it ever was in previous eras of boxing, though it's not just piracy.
Not just. It's also soft matchmaking. It's also putting fights behind a paywall that no one was asking for to begin with. Matchmakers not being as ambitious as they should be, and the fighters themselves. On that same card, you saw Demetrius Andrade opposite the ring Desmond Nicholson. It's bad enough that Demetrius was never that big a draw to begin with, but you're matching him against the journeyman and charging...
You're putting that behind a paywall.
You're charging people $80 to see it. Also on the undercard was unbeaten up-and-comer Jaron Boots Ennis, who is not yet a marquee fighter, not yet a marquee attraction. Opposite the ring, an even lesser-known fighter with no buzz in Karen Chukatsian.
Rashidi Ellis, too.
Then unbeaten Rashidi Ellis, who was opposite the ring, Roman Villa. And these fighters, if it's your goal, your aspiration to turn them into marquee fighters, draws, ticket sellers, it doesn't help that you're essentially developing them behind a paywall.
This guy's ass backwards.
Moving backwards, if it were Gervonta Davis versus Ryan Garcia, and one or some of these fighters were fighting on that undercard, then I would understand, because that is a pay-per-view, that is a box office fight that's sure to bring in a lot of eyes. But Gervonta Davis versus Hector Garcia...
Nobody was asking for that.
And if the hope was that Gervonta Davis, by way of his own celebrity, will sell enough pay-per-views to get eyes on those guys, whoever thought that was wrong.
Whoever thought that has grossly overshot it, grossly overestimated Gervonta Davis's drawing power, which I often say here on the channel.
Which I often talk about. He's not as big a draw as he's made out to be, and a lot of what you're seeing is just smoke and mirrors. War a Week Radio
Podcaster, another content creator here on YouTube, he heard something similar via his own sources, as you can imagine. This number from Rick Glacier is being met with some skepticism in some circles that want to continue believing that Gervonta Davis is this big pay-per-view draw.
This big attraction. War a Week Radio says it's true. I was told it sold only 58,000.
It's not hard to believe in this landscape, in this economy, that Gervonta Davis is now struggling to sell 100,000 pay-per-view buys.
That these may very well be the worst numbers he's ever put up for a box office fight, because many of his box office fights aren't fights that the consumers are asking for. Fights that the consumers are essentially willing to consume. Nobody was asking him to fight Hector Garcia.
And if you're expecting the average boxing fan to fork over $75 or $80 to see a fight they weren't asking for, you're dreaming.
You ask yourself, if Gervonta Davis really isn't as big a draw as everybody says he is, then why do they keep sticking him on pay-per-view.
Out of a need.
Out of necessity. Resources at Showtime are likely scarce right now, and they can't spend as much money on boxing as they used to in previous eras back when Showtime was more of an industry giant. Thus, they must pursue other avenues of opportunity to get the fighters paid, to get the fighters...
It's not as complicated as it sounds. If resources are scarce, Showtime can't just run around giving every fighter that wants a big guarantee big money.
They don't have the resources at this time to do that. They have a lot of fighters to accommodate. Thus, they stick these fighters on pay-per-view, hoping that the rest of the money will come from me and you,
the consumers.
They keep the operational costs low, putting Gervonta Davis in there with inexpensive opponents that don't cost a lot of money.
Keep the operational costs for the show low so the break-even point isn't hard to clear.
Isn't hard to hit. And it's obvious.
To a clever man it is.
Gervonta Davis versus Hector Garcia is not a box office fight, but if it ends up at the box office, it's coming from a need.
Not because the fans are demanding it, not because they need it, but because the network needs to find some kind of way to get the fighter paid.
The network itself likely has to mitigate spending and can't afford to give every fighter that fights on their platform a big guarantee.
So this is what happens. Fights that don't belong on pay-per-view end up there as a means to offset the operational costs.
That's it.
A lot of people are reacting to this news.
They question Rick Glacier's number. They question Rick Glacier's sources.
Though with piracy being at an all-time high, and the matchmaking not being particularly ambitious for this show, you're surprised that a lot of people didn't buy it?
Well, I'll tell you what.
What?
If this number is false, if it's fake, if it's fabricated, why don't Stefan Espinoza come right out and just tell everybody what the pay-per-view did himself? Why don't Showtime do an official press release for their box office fights? Here's why.
The one thing I'll point out, and I don't want to get too much into back and forth, but we're a public company, and there are regulations, there are legal requirements. We can't put out press releases giving fake numbers. I mean, we have shareholders, we have millions of shareholders. And in that situation, we can't, least of all, Showtime Sports or me put out a press release under the name of the corporation giving out fake numbers for some, reason. So when we put something on it, when we say, look, here's a Showtime Sports press release for Mayweather-Pacquiao or Mayweather-McGregor, that is, gone through lawyers and, everyone's looked at it and it's factual.
That was Showtime Sports president Stefan Espinoza more or less explaining why Showtime doesn't put out official press releases in reference to their box office fights, stating they can't just put out any number, but no one's asking them to put out just any number.
He's basically saying that they're not at liberty to put out false, inaccurate information, but no one's asking them to put out false, inaccurate information.
Give us the real number. If the boxing insiders like Rick Glacier and War a Week Radio are wrong, then prove them wrong.
The same way that Eddie Hearn and DAZN proved Dan Rafael wrong. Dan Rafael tweeted that the Canelo Alvarez versus Gennady Golovkin trilogy only sold approximately 500,000 pay-per-view buys, and to that, DAZN, unlike a Showtime, they made an official press release, and they stated in plain English, the pay-per-view sold a little over 1 million buys.
Where Showtime will not issue out an official press release as to how one of their box office fights performed, DAZN just did. And I said it then. I think it went over a lot of people's heads that DAZN themselves were putting out a number.
And because it's an official press release, they have to stand by it. The number has to be accurate.
Just like Stefan Espinoza said on Sirius XM. I think that went over a lot of people's heads.
These guys, man, they can't see the forest through the trees.
They really can't. The rule of thumb is, if Showtime had something to brag about, then they'd be bragging about it.
If Gervonta Davis's last box office fight did well in excess of 61,000, then come out with it.
What's with all the secrecy?
What have you got to hide?
We know what you have to hide. At least I do. I've always known.
Kids all smoke and mirrors, man.
You look at a fight like Devin Haney versus Vasil Lomachenko, which may end up being a pay-per-view, and you ask yourself, well, what's the difference between that pay-per-view and Gervonta Davis versus Hector Garcia? And the biggest difference is quality control.
The quality of the fight.
Bob Arum has now confirmed that Devin Haney versus Vasyl Lomachenko for Haney's undisputed WBA, WBC, IBF, and WBO lightweight world titles is set for May 20th, but said it's not guaranteed to take place in the USA, as the Middle East are attempting to host it.
The quality of the fight.
That's why the Middle East is attempting to host it, because of the quality of the match. You won't see Middle Eastern investors.
They don't want to bankroll Gervonta Davis versus his lighter touches.
Maybe if it were someone the ilk of a Vasyl Lomachenko or the ilk of a Devin Haney, a Shakur Stevenson, maybe then, but they don't want to bankroll Gervonta Davis versus lighter touches. That's the biggest difference between those two fights.
Showtime should be so lucky as to have Middle Eastern investors subsidize the fights they put on, but they don't, because those are not quality matches. Those are not quality fights.
With a fight like Vasyl Lomachenko and Devin Haney, should it end up on pay-per-view, the basic idea is that in order to get two really good fighters, two top-level guys in the ring, it's going to cost you some money.
Based on what they already get paid.
Their existing contract minimums, in order to satisfy their financial demands, you might have to bill their fight as a box office fight, but the saving grace for them is that there's actually a palpable demand for such a fight. There's actually a demand to see those two guys share the ring with each other.
If their fight does end up being billed as a pay-per-view.
That while neither of the two is a box office draw unto himself, that neither of the two is that big a draw individually, if you put them together, their fight may turn out to be a draw, might draw consumers, customers.
The biggest difference between a fight like that and a Gervonta Davis fight is quality control.
You shouldn't have to pay $80 to see Gervonta Davis versus a stand-in in Isaac Cruz, a nobody in a Rolly Romero, or...
You shouldn't have to.
Those kind of fights, ideally, should be billed as regular Showtime fights on their linear network, their platform. They shouldn't be billed as box office fights because there wasn't a demand for those fights to begin with, and those fights unto themselves.
Look at what these guys are being guaranteed to box Gervonta Davis.
If he really were a cash cow, if he really were as big a draw as he's made out to be, then surely Isaac Cruz would have been guaranteed more than just $300,000. Then surely Hector Garcia would have been guaranteed something bigger than $350,000.
You look at Devin Haney and Vasyl Lomachenko, the both of these guys are seven-figure fighters.
Individually, on their own, fight by fight. These guys are on the low end, the lower end of seven figures, but they both are seven-figure fighters.
So, in order to get two seven-figure fighters in the ring with each other, you might have to bill it as a pay-per-view, but why is Gervonta Davis
opposite the ring, six-figure fighters, on the lower end of six figures? Why are those fights ending up at the box office? Why are those fights not on regular Showtime?
They should be.
I told you why already. That network has a lot of fighters to accommodate, and they can't just run around giving everybody big guarantees. So the hope is they'll stick the fight on pay-per-view, hoping that the rest of the money will come from me and you.
But it doesn't, because those are ordinary fights. Very ordinary matchups.
We get better matchups than that by way of Showtime's competitors in ESPN and DAZN.
Quality control, folks. Quality control. That matters.